Welcome to the Polgar Chess University. I'm very pleased to share with you in this lesson something very exciting, a very beautiful game that was played by the American Grandmaster Kaidanonv against the legendary Grandmaster Taimanov. The game was interesting in the sense how Kaidanonv developed an attack kind of out of nowhere. In fact, used his queen-side rook to swing over to the king's side and be a very important participant in the attack against the enemy king. Well, let's see how that game came about. Game started with white playing knight to f3, and the response was d5. Started out kind of quietly, white playing b3, the Reti opening, knight f6, bishop b2, e6, and c4. White kind of pretends that he's playing as black and plays the Queen's Indian defense. Black played c5. In situations like this, if black succeeds to advance the d-pawn to d4, usually it's a good sign because the white bishop on b2 will kind of be locked up. Therefore, white responded by playing e3, preventing that pawn advance, and black followed up by playing knight c6, again with the intention to advancing the d5 pawn forward to d4, and with that limiting the mobility of white's bishop. In fact, if white right now would try to play bishop e2, black immediately could play d4, when castling, for example, would be an outright blunder, allowing the trapping of the bishop. Of course, things were not quite as bad for white, but nevertheless, it's an important pattern to be familiar with. So back to this position, where the game continued with white trading pawns on d5. Now black has an option to recapture with 3 different pieces. However, the most natural and perhaps best is to capture with the pawn. Capturing with the queen would certainly be an invitation for white to develop by gaining time, either the knight to c3 or the bishop to c4, so it doesn't look very tempting. Capturing with the knight is possible. The difficulty with that would be that after the black knight would recapture right now on d5, we can see how the black bishop all of a sudden became the prisoner of protecting the pawn on g7. So therefore, most games here would continue with pawn capturing on d5. And now white started out with an ambitious plan, but as we shall see, eventually did not follow up playing ambitiously. And those things usually don't end too well when you stop halfway and turn around. In those situations, the question arises, why did you go that way the first place? What I'm talking about is, white played bishop to b5, creating a pin to possibly follow that up by playing knight to e5 on the next move, trying to use the pin. As we can see, black felt that can afford ignoring that threat as he did. Played bishop to d6, developing, and white nevertheless could play knight e5. That's what happened. So now clearly the idea seems to be that white wants to capture on c6 and win a pawn. The interesting part was that black didn't need to waste time by playing, for example, queen c7 in protecting the knight on c6, but simply sacrificed the pawn by castling. And this is the moment where I mean that white went halfway and then turned around. White captured on c6, black captured back, and at this point white wasn't brave enough to capture the pawn on c6 but returned to e2. If the idea was to do that, it's questionable if it was worth white's time to make all those moves and then retreat. On the other hand, the challenge is that if white would have captured indeed the pawn on c6, how will that bishop come back to life? In the meantime, black would just move the rook out of danger to b8, And while it is true that the bishop will not be trapped in the foreseeable future, as it does have an escape square on a4, nevertheless, the square on a4 for the bishop, in this case with the pawn being on b3, preventing a retreat for the bishop, it's a very much out of place location. And it's not clear how that bishop will ever get back to the game where it's needed towards the middle part of the board while it's on a4. Unless white would later move the b pawn, sacrifice a pawn and get back that way. But then again, in that case, it doesn't really make sense from white's perspective. So let's go back to the game, and after black captures back on b6, white continued with bishop e2, playing kind of more peacefully. Let's evaluate the situation, what happened so far. White certainly wasted some time and is a little bit behind in development by moving the bishop twice, by moving a knight 3 times the same knight and then exchanging it. Black in the meantime has practically almost fully developed considering the next move of black's, and has a pretty good presence in the center. There are 2 things that are going for white on the other hand. One is that white has a superior pawn structure in that white has no double pawns while black does. And the second thing is that white has a lovely bishop on b2. So let's see how the struggle develops further. Instead of completing the development of the minor pieces with the bishop, the light-squared bishop, black rather first occupied the half-open file with the rook, and that something is that often happens in that we know that that rook will certainly belong on the e file, or that the other rook most likely will belong on the b file. In the meantime, that bishop on c8 is yet to be determined where it's best positioned. In fact, as you shall see in just a couple more moves, you'll understand that maybe there is no need to move that light-squared bishop anytime soon. The game continued with white castling, very natural move, and black played rook to b8, occupying that second open file as well. This move can have several ideas. One is to undouble the c pawn by advancing it to c4 if white does nothing about the fact that the white bishop right now is on an unprotected square. So it would be kind of like using a pin. Of course, white can defend against that, as they did in the game, or some other ways by protecting or moving the bishop from b2. However, black has another idea in mind as well, and we shall see that by the next move. White continued by playing d3, which on one hand opens up the d2 square for the knight's development, and on the other hand prevents black's c4 idea. And this was the moment that's so interesting, where black succeeded to get his queenside rook into the game in a very unorthodox fashion. And black Grandmaster Kaidanov played rook to b4 right now. A very nice move with the idea to swing the rook over all the way to h4. And this is the moment where white needs to think very carefully what to do. Either trying to prevent it or trying to get ready for it. Probably it's a better choice to try to prevent it, and one suggestion to do so is to advance the d-pawn. Now the rook obviously cannot jump over, and if pawn captures on d4, white could capture back with either bishop, but perhaps even better with the pawn. Now the situation is different. The e-file got fully opened. At the same time, the forced rank got closed. The rook is kind of misplaced at the moment on b4. Probably the best black can do at this stage is to retreat the rook back to b7 and regroup to e7 to double up on the e-file. Now the characteristics of the position are rather different than they were before the white pawn advanced to d4. Black got rid of the double pawns. However, the c6 pawn is still a weakness because it's on a half-open file that the white rook from a1 will have easy access to going to c1 and pressure it. The good news from Black's perspective is that White's bishop on b2 is less active now in view of the d4 pawn in front of it. So this position, I would say, is playable for both sides. I probably slightly prefer Black's perspectives, but I think White should be okay as well. Alternatively, in this position, Black could try to play some other plans, such as retreating the bishop to b8, with the idea to then play queen d6 or queen c7, provoking a weakening on White's king side. Well, in a situation like this, the battle is all ahead. Let's go back to the game where White had different ideas of the story and played knight to d2 instead of d4. I think it's a small mistake, at least. Knight d2, and now Black accomplished the goal in swinging the rook over to h4, obviously immediately threatening to capture on h2. Right now, the most natural move to me would be to play the knight to f3, not only protecting on h2, but also attacking the rook. Of course, the rook can remain on the h-file, and should, by going to h6, and Black still would have dangerous attacking chances. The game continued differently. Instead of knight f3, White played g3, attacking the rook that way and protecting the threat to the h2 pawn. The drawback of this idea is that it weakens the light squares, such as g2 and h3, near the white king. And this is a very key moment of the game, where if indeed the black rook needs to retreat, White may be doing just fine. But Black played quite brilliantly from this point on, and sacrificing number of pieces, coming up with absolutely unusual and impressive ideas. The next move was not bothering with moving the rook out of the way, but playing knight g4. It's a beautiful attacking game, so it's certainly a good way trying to improve your attacking skills. You may want to consider also try to play out this position with the black pieces against a friend or one of your computer software if you have one. Now the idea of this move is, again, going after the pawn on h2. However, in such situations, when you sacrifice a major piece like a rook, it definitely requires some calculation, and it's hard to play just by intuition. Let's see right now what happens if White indeed accepts the gift and captures on h4. Well, then it's about time to get the queen into the action and capture queen takes h4. Now the threat is obvious, and White doesn't have that many options but to play knight f3, protect the checkmate threat and attack the queen at the same time. Now the best option for Black is to play queen h3, just move away from the attack and renew threats such as bishop takes h2 or knight takes h2. You can take a few minutes and try to figure out what options White may have here and see how in each case Black will come to a winning position. Let's go back a tiny bit and see another option that White can try in this position instead of capturing the rook or instead of the game move which was bishop capturing the knight. Another interesting variation starts with White playing knight f3 right now, again protecting the h2 square and attacking the rook. Naturally, black right now has the option to simply retreat with the rook to h6 and then perhaps try to bring the queen to the attack as well and take it slowly. On the other hand, an interesting alternative is to immediately sacrifice the rook, although it doesn't seem to be sufficient to win. In this case, white can continue capturing on h2, knight captures, and now white's best option is actually to capture the knight. Sometimes you just have to put on the gloves and go for the challenge. This allows the immediate queen check on h4, which uses the pin, king g2, queen h3, king g1, and now black captures on g3, threatening to checkmate again, so white better captures, queen captures, and king h1. Well, this is a typical situation when one side sacrifices one or more pieces to destroy all pawn defense in front of the opponent's castled king position. In this case, black has sacrificed not just a rook, but also another piece, a bishop. So black, right now, either can force draw by perpetual checks on g3 and h3, or can try to bring an additional piece to the attack. Bringing the bishop to h3 right now wouldn't be much help because white could easily protect the g2 square, for example, by playing either bishop f3 or even rook g1. The other natural attempt, which would be to play rook e6 to get the rook out to h6, also is not quite so simple because white could respond right now by playing bishop h5 and then get the queen to f3, or the rook in some cases, chasing the black queen away. Of course, the good news for black, the draw is still in the pocket. Black can still repeat moves by queen h3 followed by queen g3. So the conclusion is that after white's knight f3 move on move 15, what we saw in this position, black, if intends to play for a win, better retreats the rook. If you're happy with a draw, you may go for the sacrifice. To continue with the game, white responded right now by capturing black's knight on g4. Bishop captured g4. Black recaptures with the bishop to activate the bishop and with a tempo at it, attacking white's queen immediately. And now it's another interesting moment. So far we still have material balance. The game continued with white playing f3, which is certainly the ambitious move to make, because at that point both the black rook and bishop will be hanging simultaneously. Before we continue with the actual game, let's find out what would have happened if white instead just moves the queen. Now, in contrary with the previous analysis variation with 15 knight f3, black is able to succeed with a similar combination that we already saw, namely capturing on h2, bringing the queen to the attack with queen h4. Now if queen g2, then just queen h3 check, so it doesn't matter. King g1, bishop captures, pawn captures, queen captures, king h1, and the rook in this case is ready to come and decide the game. Now white does not have a light squared bishop that would go to h5 as we have seen in the previous variation. And let's go back one more time to the position after bishop g4, where white, as I mentioned, continued right now by playing f3. And now, again, as we already know, the idea is to play rook h2. If king takes, no surprise, queen h4 check, and black actually checkmates in a couple moves in view that the white pawn is no longer on f2 to recapture on g3. But white can instead capture the bishop on g4. And now comes the amazing part of the game. Black continues sacrificing the rook on h2 and played rook e3. The threats are clear. Black is about to capture on g3, forcing the white king to h2 and then queen h4 checkmate. But white had an idea up his sleeve, namely to give up the bishop interposed, preventing that queen from coming to h4. Now indeed, if black captures the bishop with the pawn on f6, the white king will capture on h2 and will be out of the woods. But this is the amazing move that I bet Taimanov overlooked when allowed black's combination. If you feel like, try to figure out in your own. See if you can play like Grandmaster Kaidanonv did. And that brilliant move was playing rook to h3 right now. An absolutely brilliant move. First, let's see what will happen if white captures the queen. Then black will checkmate in a few moves. Rook takes, king f2, rook h2, king e1, rook e3. Now already black is safe, winning the queen back. Rook captures, two rooks in the second rank, extremely dangerous. Rook d2, if king goes back to e1 now, then the h2 rook checkmates on e2. Or, after king c1, black will continue by playing c4, opening up the diagonal for the bishop on d6, threatening to play bishop a3, and the checkmate is not too far away. Black is completely winning here. And finally, let's see how the game ended. After the brilliant rook h3 move, white continued by playing rook f3 instead. Now the response was the simple rook takes pawn on g3. If white now trades rooks, the black rook recaptures with a check, and black simply picks up the bishop on f6. On the other hand, after king h1, pawn just captured. Now black already has 3 extra pawns, which is significant material advantage, and the game ended a couple moves later after white resigning in this position. A brilliant game, congratulations to Grigory Kaidanonv. And now let's see the jewel of the week. In this endgame, bishop endgame, which was composed by Procas in 1959, it is white's turn. The challenge is that if white right now captures the pawn on a7, that pawn will not succeed to get promoted without the black bishop being able to capture it. And the game will be a quick draw. Try to figure out what may be the winning plan. And the solution is the following. Instead of grabbing the pawn, white gives up his own pawn by advancing it to b7. Forces the bishop to capture, otherwise it promotes. b4 check, only move king a6, and now comes the amazing part. Bishop g4, putting black in zugzwang. The move has no immediate threat. However, if the c-pawn advances, the bishop retreats to e2, checkmating, or if the bishop moves away, that will allow bishop check, followed by pawn check, and then capturing black's bishop. And fortunately for white, after c3, the bishop catches the pawn right on time, leaving white with an easily won endgame. I hope you enjoyed both our main game as well as the jewel of the week, and be back next week for some more chess knowledge. Bye-bye.